Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing at the edge of a misty Pacific Northwest forest in the dead of winter. The air is cold enough to see your breath, yet there's warmth emanating from somewhere deeper in the woods. You hear it before you see it. The rhythmic pulse of drums, the haunting melody of voices rising and falling like waves against ancient shores. Through the towering cedars and Douglas firs, firelight flickers against wooden walls that seem to breathe with the ceremony happening inside. This is not a museum recreation. This is not a historical reenactment for tourists. This is the living heartbeat of a civilization that has maintained its spiritual practices for thousands of years, long before the pyramids rose in Egypt, long before Rome dreamed of empire. Most people who visit the Pacific Northwest today see the stunning landscapes, the emerald waters of Puget Sound, the snow-capped peaks of the Cascades, the temperate rainforests draped in moss. They see the modern cities, the tech companies, the coffee culture. But they miss the profound truth hidden in plain sight. Beneath the surface of contemporary life, ancient wisdom ceremonies continue, connecting the present generation to ancestors who walked these lands when mammoths still roamed North America. The Coast Salish peoples, encompassing dozens of distinct tribes and linguistic groups stretching from British Columbia to Oregon, have maintained one of the most sophisticated ceremonial traditions on the continent. And at the center of this spiritual universe stands the winter longhouse, a structure so ingeniously designed, so rich with cultural meaning, that understanding it requires us to completely reimagine what we think we know about indigenous architecture, community, and sacred practice. Here's what most people get wrong about Native American cultures of the Pacific Northwest. They see the totem poles, the art, the salmon, and they think they understand. They reduce thousands of years of philosophical development, social engineering, and spiritual wisdom into simple stereotypes. They imagine primitive peoples living simple lives, never recognizing the breathtaking complexity of societies that built massive wooden structures without metal tools, developed governance systems that would influence the American Constitution, and created ceremonial practices so powerful they were actually outlawed by the US and Canadian governments. Because those governments recognized the threat that such strong cultural identity posed to assimilation. The winter longhouse ceremonies were banned, the dances were forbidden, the potlatches were criminalized, and yet they survived. The ceremonies continued in secret, passed down through generations who refused to let their culture die, who understood that what happened in those longhouses was not entertainment or mere tradition. It was the very fabric of their identity, their connection to the spirit world, their treaty with the natural forces that sustained them. What I find most powerful about this story is how it challenges our modern assumptions about progress and civilization. We live in an age of steel and concrete, of digital connection and instant communication. Yet the Coast Salish peoples created gathering spaces that fostered deeper community bonds, more effective governance, and more profound spiritual experiences than most of what we've built today. The longhouse was not just a building. It was a living philosophy made wood and ceremony. Tonight, we're going to step inside that world. We'll learn how massive structures were raised using only stone, bone, and wood. We'll discover why winter, the season of darkness and cold, was chosen as the most sacred time for ceremony. We'll explore family structures and governance systems so sophisticated that they maintained peace and prosperity across vast territories without written laws or standing armies. And we'll witness the ceremonies themselves, the masked dances, the spirit songs, the initiation rites that transformed individuals and renewed entire communities. This journey will take us 90 minutes, but the wisdom we'll encounter spans 10,000 years. Let us begin. Before we can understand the ceremonies, we must understand what we're really looking at when we see a Coast Salish winter longhouse. Because hidden in the very construction of these buildings, in every beam and plank, in the way they orient to the cardinal directions, in how they were built and who built them, hidden in all of this is a complete worldview. a philosophy about humanity's relationship to nature, to community, to the spirit realm. The promise of this exploration is this: by the time we emerge from the longhouse at the end of our journey, you will understand that indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest were not living in harmony with nature by accident or instinct. They were implementing a carefully developed, philosophically sophisticated approach to sustainability, community, and spirituality that modern society is only now beginning to rediscover, often while failing to credit the cultures that perfected these principles millennia ago. But here's what most people don't realize about Coast Salish culture. It wasn't a single, monolithic tradition. The term Coast Salish actually encompasses over 50 distinct tribal groups, each with their own dialects, territories, and ceremonial variations. The Duwamish, the Snoqualmie, the Tulalip, the Lummi, the Squamish, the Cowichan, the Nooksack, each maintained unique traditions while participating in a broader cultural network connected by trade, marriage, and shared spiritual concepts. What united them was the winter ceremonial season, roughly spanning from November through February, when the salmon runs had ended, when the berries had been harvested and preserved, when the days grew short and the rains came heavy. This was when the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. This was when the spirits were most active, most willing to interact with humans. And this was when the community gathered in the longhouses to renew their relationships with those spirits, to pass down teachings to the next generation, to resolve disputes, to heal the sick, and to celebrate the bonds that held their society together. The winter longhouse was simultaneously a dwelling, a sacred temple, a community center, a courthouse, a university, and a theater. Understanding how one structure could serve all these functions requires us to completely reimagine what architecture can be. In this journey, you will learn the engineering marvel, how Coast Salish peoples felled massive cedar trees, some over 8 feet in diameter, using controlled fire and stone tools, how they split these logs into perfectly straight planks using wooden wedges and cedar withes, how they raised roof beams weighing several tons without pulleys or metal fasteners, how they created structures that could house 100 people or more while remaining waterproof through months of Pacific Northwest rain, the sacred geometry, how longhouses were oriented to cosmic forces, how their internal divisions reflected social structures, how every element carried symbolic meaning, the entrance facing east to greet the morning sun, the fire pits aligned along the central axis, the family sections arranged by rank and lineage. Nothing was arbitrary, everything was intentional. The ceremonial cycle. How winter dances unfolded over weeks and months, each ceremony building on the last. How individuals received their spirit songs and powers. How masked dancers embodied supernatural beings. How the entire community participated in rituals that reinforced cosmic order, resolved conflicts, redistributed wealth, and initiated the young into adult responsibilities. The governance wisdom. How decisions were made through consensus rather than decree. How hereditary leaders balanced authority with obligation. How wealth was measured not by accumulation, but by redistribution. How entire regions maintained peace through complex kinship networks and ceremonial exchanges rather than through military force. And perhaps most importantly, you will understand why this knowledge matters now, in our modern world of isolation, environmental crisis, and spiritual disconnection. The longhouse traditions offer more than historical interest. They offer solutions to contemporary problems, approaches that our ancestors knew and that we desperately need to remember. To understand the longhouse, we must first understand the land that shaped the people who built it. Picture the Pacific Northwest coastline as it existed for thousands of years before European contact. This is a landscape of dramatic contrasts. Towering snow-capped mountains rising directly from the sea, temperate rainforests receiving up to 200 inches of rain annually, creating ecosystems of almost unimaginable richness, rivers thick with salmon during spawning season, tide pools teeming with shellfish, forests of cedar, hemlock, and Douglas fir so massive that individual trees might be 1,000 years old. This was not an easy paradise. Winters brought freezing rains and occasional snow. Storms roared in from the Pacific with terrifying power. The sea could provide abundance one day and take lives the next. But for peoples who learned to live in balance with these forces, who developed technologies and social systems adapted to this specific environment, the Pacific Northwest offered resources unmatched almost anywhere on the continent. The Coast Salish peoples who emerged here represent one of the world's most successful sedentary hunter-gatherer cultures. Unlike most hunter-gatherer societies, which remained nomadic by necessity, Coast Salish communities established permanent villages supported by salmon runs so predictable they functioned as agriculture. The salmon came every year, in numbers so vast they seemed inexhaustible, providing protein that could be dried and stored through winter. This reliability allowed for population density, social complexity, and artistic development typically associated only with agricultural civilizations. To understand how Coast Salish culture developed, we must journey back at least 10,000 years to when the great ice sheets of the last glacial period finally retreated from the Pacific Northwest. As the ice withdrew, it carved the dramatic geography we see today: the fjords of Puget Sound, the channels of the Salish Sea, the river valleys that would become salmon highways. The earliest peoples arrived following game and gathering plants, but they quickly recognized the extraordinary potential of this landscape. By 8,000 years ago, archaeological evidence shows permanent village sites with sophisticated fishing technologies, weirs, traps, dip nets. By 5,000 years ago, large plank houses appear in the archaeological record. By 2,000 years ago, the core elements of Coast Salish culture had emerged: permanent winter villages, seasonal resource camps, elaborate art styles, and complex ceremonial practices. This wasn't primitive simplicity. This was the result of millennia of cultural evolution, of trial and error, of accumulated knowledge passed down through countless generations. The winter longhouse ceremonies we're exploring represent the flowering of this 10,000-year conversation between humans and the landscape they called home. The Coast Salish peoples divided their year into two distinct seasons, each with its own rhythm, its own economic focus, and its own spiritual character. The warm season, roughly March through October, was a time of dispersal and abundance. Families left the winter villages and traveled to seasonal camps, fishing stations along rivers during salmon runs, berry-picking grounds in mountain meadows, clam beaches along the coast, root-gathering areas and prairies. This was the season of work, of harvesting and preserving the resources that would sustain communities through winter. It was also a season of trade, of gathering with other groups, of arranging marriages and forming alliances. But winter was different. Winter was when communities returned to the permanent villages, when families gathered in the longhouses, when the sacred season began. The Coast Salish called this time the time when the trees crack because of the sharp sounds of ice-laden branches breaking in the forest. It was a time when the natural world seemed to pause, when bears hibernated and birds migrated south, when salmon rested in the deep pools of rivers, gathering strength for their spawning runs. And it was during this pause in the natural world that the spiritual world became most active. Picture this: a November evening in a Coast Salish village, perhaps along the Duwamish River near what is now Seattle, or on the shores of Bellingham Bay, or in the Fraser River Valley. The sun sets early, barely after 4 o'clock, and the darkness settles thick and complete. Rain drums steadily on cedar roofs, and wind moves through the forest like breathing. Inside the longhouses, fires burn in stone-lined pits down the center of the building, their smoke rising through roof openings designed with adjustable planks that could be shifted to control draft and keep rain out. Families gather around their individual fire pits, children listening as elders tell stories, but not just any stories. These are the sacred narratives, the ones that can only be told in winter when the spirits are listening. Stories about the transformer figures who shaped the landscape in the before time. Stories about the first peoples who came from the sky or emerged from the earth. Stories about supernatural salmon chiefs, about killer whales who could become human, about the giants and wild women and spirit bears that inhabit the deep forest. These stories are not entertainment. They are education in its deepest sense. They teach cosmology, geography, ethics, natural history, and spiritual truth simultaneously. Each story locates the listeners in a living cosmos, where humans are neither supreme nor separate, but participants in an ongoing relationship with all beings, physical and spiritual. Coast Salish spirituality was fundamentally animistic and relational. Everything possessed spirit: animals, plants, mountains, rivers, even tools and canoes. These spirits could be benevolent or dangerous, helpful or indifferent, but they were always present and always required respect. The relationship between humans and spirits was conceived as a kind of reciprocal exchange. Spirits could grant powers to humans, abilities to hunt, to heal, to see the future, to influence weather, to create art, to lead communities. But these powers came with responsibilities. They required proper acknowledgement through ceremony. They demanded that humans maintain balance, never taking too much, always giving thanks, performing the rituals that kept the cosmos in harmony. This is why the winter ceremonial season was so crucial. It was the time when individuals who had received spirit powers during vision quests or dreams would publicly claim those powers through dance and song. It was when those powers would be validated by the community. It was when the entire society renewed its contracts with the spiritual forces that sustained it. This ancient understanding reveals something profound that modern society has largely forgotten: that power and responsibility are inseparable. In Coast Salish thought, to receive a gift from the spirit world was not privilege, it was obligation. Those with greater powers had greater duties to serve the community. Wealth meant the ability to give, not to hoard. Leadership meant service, not domination. We live in a time when power and responsibility have been divorced from each other, when accumulation is celebrated regardless of its effects on community or environment. The longhouse traditions remind us that our ancestors knew better. They built societies where balance was not just an ideal, but a requirement, enforced through ceremony and social pressure and spiritual understanding. The Coast Salish territories encompassed an interconnected world of waterways. This was a maritime culture, where cedar canoes were the primary transportation, where knowledge of tides and currents was essential, where the Salish Sea functioned as a highway connecting communities. Villages were typically located at river mouths, where fresh water met salt water, where salmon came to spawn, where canoes could be easily launched. These locations were chosen after centuries of observation, identifying the spots where resources were most abundant and reliable, where beaches offered safe landing, where the land provided drainage and protection from winter storms. A typical winter village might have consisted of several large longhouses arranged roughly parallel to the shoreline, facing the water. Behind the houses, the land rose toward the forest edge, where trails led to hunting grounds, berry patches, and other resource areas. In front of the houses, beaches served as work areas and canoe landings. The entire village was oriented toward the water, because water was the source of life. Salmon, shellfish, sea mammals, waterfowl, and transportation. The social organization of Coast Salish villages reflected a sophisticated class system quite different from modern democratic ideals, yet also different from the rigid hierarchies of European feudalism. At the top were hereditary leaders, individuals who had inherited rights to certain resource areas, ceremonial prerogatives, and leadership responsibilities. These were not absolute monarchs, but rather stewards of resources and knowledge, expected to manage territorial resources wisely and to provide for community members during times of scarcity. Below the hereditary elite were commoners, free individuals who had use rights to resources but did not own them. At the bottom were slaves, typically captured in raids or inherited through descent, who had no rights but were also not typically mistreated in the brutal ways chattel slavery operated in other societies. But this hierarchy was tempered by complex obligations. A high-ranking person who failed to fulfill duties, who hoarded rather than shared, who refused to help those in need, who violated ceremonial protocols, could lose status. Rank was not just birth. It had to be continually validated through proper behavior and generosity. This is the world that created the Winter Longhouse, a world where humans lived at the intersection of sea and forest, of physical and spiritual realms, of individual and community, of rank and obligation. The Longhouse itself embodied all these relationships in wood and ceremony. Now we are ready to understand how it was built. The Winter Longhouse of the Coast Salish peoples represents one of the most impressive architectural achievements of indigenous North America. To modernize, accustomed to thinking of primitive peoples with primitive technologies, the scale and sophistication of these structures is startling. A typical winter longhouse might be 60 feet wide, 100 to 200 feet long, and 20 feet high at the center. Some were even larger. Ethnographic accounts describe longhouses 300 feet in length, capable of housing 8 or 10 extended families, 100 people or more. The walls were constructed of massive cedar planks, some 2 feet wide and 3 inches thick, fitted together with remarkable precision. The roof consisted of cedar shakes over massive log beams designed to shed the torrential winter rains of the Pacific Northwest while allowing smoke from interior fires to escape. And all of this was accomplished without metal tools, without nails, without screws or bolts. Using only stone, bone, wood, and most crucially, the intimate knowledge of materials that came from thousands of years of experimental tradition. The construction of a longhouse was not a casual undertaking. It required the coordinated effort of an entire community, months of labor, and the blessing of spiritual powers. It was simultaneously a practical endeavor and a sacred act, because the longhouse was not just shelter. It was the physical embodiment of community itself, the space where human and spirit worlds would intersect. But here's what most people don't realize about traditional longhouse construction. The builders were working with one of the most extraordinary materials in the natural world, Western red cedar. This tree, which can grow to heights over 200 feet and live for over 1,000 years, has properties that seem almost magical. Cedar is naturally rot-resistant, allowing planks and posts to remain sound for decades, even in the wet climate of the Pacific Northwest. It splits cleanly along the grain, meaning large trees can be transformed into perfect planks with relatively simple tools. It's light but strong, easy to carve but durable. And it's aromatic, filling structures with a scent that is both pleasant and acts as a mild insect repellent. Coast Salish peoples called cedar the tree of life, and the name was not metaphorical. Cedar provided the planks for their houses, the logs for their canoes, the bark for their clothing and baskets, the roots for their rope and basketry, the withes for lashing and binding. Cedar was the material that made their entire way of life possible. And they understood this tree with an intimacy that bordered on mystical. The process of building a longhouse began long before construction, with the selection of trees. This was not simply a matter of finding large cedars, which were abundant, but of finding the right cedars in the right locations. Trees had to be straight, free from significant disease or damage, and ideally located where they could be floated to the building site after felling. But before any tree could be felled, it had to be approached with proper ceremony. The tree was addressed as a living being, a relative, and permission was requested for its use. Prayers were offered, sometimes gifts of food or tobacco. This was not superstition, but recognition of the reciprocal relationship between humans and the natural world. The tree was giving its life so that humans might live. That gift required acknowledgement and gratitude. The actual felling of a massive cedar, trees that might be 8 or 10 feet in diameter at the base, was accomplished through controlled burning. A fire was set at the base of the tree, carefully tended and controlled, with the flames directed by stone tools and kept from spreading by applying wet moss or bark to the sides of the tree that were not meant to burn. Over hours or even days, the fire would burn through the tree's base. At the critical moment, the tree would be pulled in the desired direction using ropes of twisted cedar bark or strips of cedar root. The sound of such a tree falling must have been tremendous, a groaning, cracking roar as tons of wood began to move, followed by the crash and shaking of earth as it hit the ground. This was a moment of both triumph and sorrow, celebration and prayer. A giant of the forest had been transformed into material for human use, but its sacrifice was not forgotten. Once felled, the tree had to be processed into usable lumber. The branches were removed using stone axes and adzes, tools that, in the hands of skilled workers, were remarkably effective despite lacking metal edges. The log was then sectioned into lengths appropriate for planks or posts. This is where the remarkable properties of cedar become crucial. Cedar has a very straight, even grain, and it can be split with astonishing precision using wooden wedges. The technique involved cutting a shallow groove along the length of the log, then inserting wedges of yew or other hardwood into the groove. By driving these wedges deeper, using stone mauls, the log could be split lengthwise, producing planks that were remarkably flat and even. This wasn't crude work. Archaeological examination of plank houses shows that individual boards were often less than an inch variation in thickness along their entire length. The craftspeople performing this work were not just laborers but artists, reading the wood's grain, understanding where it wanted to split, coaxing rather than forcing the material to take the desired form. For structural posts and beams, logs were shaped using controlled burning and adze work. A post hole might be burned into the base of a log to fit over a stone foundation. A beam might be partially hollowed to reduce weight while maintaining strength. The knowledge required for this work was profound. Understanding wood's response to different treatments, knowing how to read grain to predict strength and weakness, having the skill to shape massive pieces of wood with precision using only hand tools. Picture this scene. A Coast Salish building site in early autumn, preparing for winter. Perhaps 20 or 30 people are working together. Some are stripping bark from logs using elk bone or stone scrapers, their movements rhythmic and practiced. Others are splitting planks from a massive cedar log, the sharp crack of wooden wedges being struck punctuating the air. A group of younger men, supervised by an elder, is shaping a massive roof beam, using controlled fire to char the wood, then scraping away the char with stone adzes, gradually creating the desired curve and thickness. Children watch and learn, understanding that someday they will perform these tasks. Elders move among the workers, not directing in the sense of giving orders, but offering guidance based on decades of experience, pointing out a change in grain that indicates where a split should stop, suggesting a better angle for the adze work, sharing stories about previous building projects and the lessons learned from mistakes. This is education through participation, knowledge transfer through demonstration. There are no blueprints, no written instructions. The design of the longhouse exists in the collective memory of the community, in the hands of workers who learned from those who learned from those who learned, stretching back generations beyond counting. The actual raising of the longhouse followed a carefully planned sequence. First, large posts were set into the ground along what would become the perimeter of the structure. These posts, often 30 feet tall and 2 feet thick, had to be precisely placed and absolutely vertical because they would support the entire weight of the roof. Setting these posts required coordinated effort. A deep hole would be dug, 3 or 4 feet down, and stones placed at the bottom for drainage and stability. The post would be positioned near the hole, then raised using a combination of human strength and simple machines. Inclined planes of logs to roll the post up, ropes to pull from multiple angles. As the post reached vertical, it would be walked into position over its hole, then allowed to drop into place. Immediately, workers would pack stones and earth around the base, tamping it firm to hold the post upright. The rhythm of this work, the chanting that coordinated group effort, the careful communication needed to ensure everyone pulled or pushed at the right moment, created a ceremonial atmosphere, even in what was essentially construction work. This was the community literally building itself, creating the structure that would house its winter gatherings. Once the perimeter posts were in place, the central posts, even taller, supporting the ridge beam, would be raised. Then came the roof beams themselves, massive logs that might weigh several tons each. These had to be lifted 20 feet in the air and set precisely onto the tops of the support posts. The method for raising roof beams was ingenious. A ramp of logs and earth would be constructed, creating an inclined plane reaching from ground level to the top of the posts. The beam would be rolled up this ramp using smaller logs as rollers, with ropes attached to pull from above and guide ropes to control the beam's movement. At the top of the ramp, the beam would be carefully maneuvered into position, then secured to the posts using pegs, lashings, and notches carved into the wood. This ancient engineering reveals something profound about the relationship between limitation and ingenuity. Modern construction has access to cranes, power tools, metal fasteners, and all manner of mechanical assistance. Yet Coast Salish builders, working with only human strength and simple tools, accomplished feats that seem impossible to contemporary eyes. They did this not by overcoming their limitations through brute force, but by understanding materials so deeply, by coordinating human effort so effectively, that limitation became opportunity for creativity. We live in an age that often equates progress with technological complexity, assuming that more tools mean better results. The longhouse tradition reminds us that deep knowledge, careful observation, and cooperative effort can accomplish wonders with the simplest means. Sometimes the most sophisticated technology is not the newest, but the one refined over thousands of years of practice. With the structural frame complete, the walls and roof needed to be enclosed. This was done using cedar planks, the boards split from logs in the earlier stages of the project. But these planks were not permanently attached to the frame. Instead, they were held in place by a system that allowed them to be removed and transported. Why this modularity? Because many Coast Salish groups did not build new longhouses for each winter village. Instead, they maintained frames at multiple locations: winter villages, summer fishing camps, gathering areas. The planks, representing thousands of hours of labor, were the family's movable property. When the season changed and it was time to relocate, the planks would be removed from the frame, loaded into large freight canoes, and transported to the next location, where they would be fitted onto a different frame. The planks were held to the frame posts using a combination of methods. Some were lashed with cedar withes, thin, flexible strips of inner cedar bark or cedar root that could be tightly bound, creating a secure attachment that was nonetheless removable. Others were held by friction and gravity, slotted into grooves carved into posts. Still others were secured by crossbeams that pressed them against the posts. The roof was typically covered with cedar shakes, thin wooden shingles split from blocks of cedar. These overlapped like scales, shedding water effectively. In some areas, sheets of cedar bark were used instead, providing excellent waterproofing. The roofs were designed with adjustable smoke holes, openings that could be covered or uncovered by shifting planks from inside the house, allowing smoke to escape while protecting against rain. The completed longhouse was a marvel of engineering, strong enough to withstand Pacific Northwest wind and snow, waterproof enough to remain dry through months of rain, flexible enough to sway in storms without breaking, designed with ventilation that kept interior fires burning cleanly while preserving warmth. And all of this accomplished through intimate knowledge of materials, refined engineering principles passed down through generations, and cooperative labor that turned construction into community building. Now finally, we are ready to step inside and witness the ceremonies that gave the winter longhouse its deepest purpose. It is late November. The salmon runs have ended for the year. The berries have been picked and dried. The roots have been gathered and stored. The families have returned from their summer camps to the winter village, and the longhouse planks have been fitted onto the permanent frame. Smoke rises from the roof openings, and as night falls, the sound of drums begins to echo across the water. The sacred season has begun. For the Coast Salish peoples, winter was not dead time, not merely survival until spring. Winter was when the spiritual dimension of existence became most accessible, most powerful. This was when individuals who had received spirit powers during vision quests or spontaneous encounters would claim those powers publicly. This was when masked dances brought supernatural beings into the human realm. This was when the community would renew its relationship with the forces that sustained it. The winter ceremonial season typically lasted from November through February or early March, though the intensity varied. Some ceremonies occurred weekly, others only once or twice per season. The exact timing depended on community needs, on spiritual guidance received by ritual leaders, on practical considerations like weather and food supplies. But when the ceremonies were happening, the longhouse was transformed from dwelling into temple, from community center into doorway between worlds. To understand why these ceremonies were so powerful, and why colonial governments felt threatened enough to ban them, we need to understand what was actually happening during winter dances. These were not performances in the modern entertainment sense. They were not symbolic representations or reenactments of past events. In Coast Salish belief, the dances were actual encounters with spiritual power, moments when the supernatural directly entered the human community. When a masked dancer entered the longhouse, they were not simply wearing a costume and playing a role. They were understood to have been possessed by or transformed into the being the mask represented. The person behind the mask had temporarily ceased to be fully human and had become a bridge, allowing that spiritual entity to manifest in the physical world. This understanding made the ceremonies dangerous. Spirits were powerful, and power was inherently risky. Proper protocols had to be followed exactly. Songs had to be sung correctly. Dances had to be performed with precision. The slightest error might offend a spirit, might allow power to escape control, might bring harm instead of blessing. This was serious business. This was not theater but transformation, not entertainment, but engagement with forces that could heal or harm, empower or overwhelm. The interior of a longhouse during winter ceremonies was a carefully organized space, every element carrying meaning. Down the center of the building, fire pits burned, typically 4 or 6 of them, evenly spaced, each serving a particular family or group of families. The fires provided light, warmth, and a focal point for family life. But they also served ceremonial purposes, their smoke carrying prayers upward, their flames creating the flickering light that allowed the boundary between physical and spiritual to blur. The longhouse was typically divided internally into family compartments along both sides, with a wide central aisle left clear for ceremonies and processions. Each family's area was marked by partition walls of woven mats or wooden planks, creating semi-private spaces that nonetheless opened onto the communal center. These compartments were arranged by rank, the highest status families occupying the areas near the center of the longhouse, with status decreasing toward the ends. But during major ceremonies, these divisions became less important. The longhouse became a single unified space, with all attention focused on the central aisle where the dances would occur. The end of the longhouse typically featured a large cleared area where dancers could emerge. Often, this area was partially screened by mats or planks, creating a space where dancers could prepare unseen, then burst forth into the firelight when the moment was right. The dramatic impact of this staging was intentional. The sudden appearance of a masked figure from darkness into firelight, accompanied by drums and singing, created a visceral experience of supernatural presence. Let us witness a spirit dance ceremony as it might have unfolded on a winter night in a Coast Salish longhouse. This description is based on ethnographic accounts, though we must remember that these were sacred ceremonies with elements that were kept secret, shared only with initiates. The evening begins with the entire community gathering in the longhouse. Children are present. This is their education, but they sit quietly, knowing that proper behavior is essential. Elders occupy places of honor near the center fires. The atmosphere is charged with anticipation. Drummers take their positions. Coast Salish drums were typically hand drums, wooden frames covered with animal hide, struck with wooden beaters. The rhythm they create is not merely accompaniment, but the heartbeat of the ceremony, the pulse that will drive everything that follows. The drumming begins, a steady, hypnotic rhythm that seems to sink into bones and chest, making hearts synchronize with its beat. Then singing starts, many voices joining in a song that has been passed down through generations. These are spirit songs, each belonging to specific individuals who received them from their guardian spirits. The songs have no words in the conventional sense. They are composed of vocables, syllables that carry meaning beyond language. Close your eyes and imagine the sensory experience of being present. The air is thick with smoke from the fires, carrying the scent of burning cedar, of cooking food, of the damp wool and cedar bark clothing worn by the gathered community. The temperature is warm near the fires but cool toward the walls, creating currents of air that make the flames dance. The light is dim and flickering, creating moving shadows on the plank walls, making it impossible to see clearly into the darker corners of the longhouse. The drumming fills the space, not loud but pervasive, impossible to ignore or tune out. The singing weaves around the drums, voices rising and falling, sometimes harmonizing, sometimes creating intentional dissonance that sets teeth on edge. And underlying it all, the occasional sound of rain on the roof, wind in the trees outside, reminding everyone that beyond the firelit circle, the winter darkness stretches vast and complete. Without warning, a figure appears in the central aisle. The appearance seems magical, one moment empty space, the next a presence, as if materialized from air. This is a masked dancer, wearing a carved cedar mask that represents one of the supernatural beings of Coast Salish cosmology. The mask might represent a Squamish, a wild man of the woods, covered in hair, possessing tremendous strength. Or it might be a transformer figure, one of the ancient beings who shaped the world in the before time. Or it might be an animal spirit, killer whale, bear, thunderbird, rendered in carved cedar and decorated with paint and shredded cedar bark. The masks themselves were extraordinary works of art. Carved from single blocks of cedar, they could be simple or elaborate, realistic or highly stylized. Some masks had movable parts, hinged jaws, that could open and close, revealing inner faces or features. Some incorporated human hair, feathers, or animal fur. All were painted with mineral and plant-based pigments in the distinctive Coast Salish art style. Formline designs that flowed and curved, red and black on the natural cedar, creating images that were simultaneously abstract and powerfully representational. The dancer moves in a way that is not quite human. The gait is stilted, strange, the body movement suggesting something other inhabiting a human form. This is intentional. The dancer is embodying the spirit, moving as that being would move, demonstrating through physical action that transformation has occurred. The audience responds with a mix of reverence and apprehension. Depending on the spirit being represented, people might lean back, might cover their faces, might reach out as if to touch power. The elders watch carefully, ready to intervene if the dancer shows signs of being overwhelmed by the spirit, if the possession becomes dangerous. The dance might last minutes or hours. It might be violent and frenetic or slow and deliberate. Throughout, the drums never stop. The singing continues, creating a sonic environment that seems to hold the dancer within it, to support the manifestation of spiritual power. One of the most important functions of winter ceremonies was the initiation of young people who had received spirit powers. In Coast Salish belief, these encounters typically occurred during adolescence or young adulthood, often during vision quests undertaken in isolated locations. mountains, caves, deep forests, where the boundary between worlds was thin. A young person might fast for days, exposing themselves to the elements, seeking a vision. Or a spirit might appear spontaneously in dreams or during ordinary activities. The encounter was terrifying. Spirits were dangerous, their power overwhelming. But if the individual could endure the encounter, could accept the power being offered, they would receive a spirit song and specific abilities. However, receiving the power was only the first step. That power had to be validated by the community, had to be properly integrated into the social fabric. This happened during the winter ceremonial season, when the individual would be brought out, ceremonially presented to the community, dancing their spirit dance and singing their spirit song for the first time publicly. The bringing out ceremony was intense. The initiate would be prepared by elders who had gone through the process themselves, who knew how to manage spiritual power. They would fast, purify themselves through sweating and bathing in cold water, prepare mentally and spiritually for what was to come. When the moment arrived, the initiate would be led into the longhouse by attendants, often appearing dazed or in an altered state. The drums would begin the rhythm specific to their spirit power, and the initiate would begin to dance, their body moving not by conscious choice but driven by the spirit within them. But here's what most people don't realize about spirit power in Coast Salish culture. It wasn't optional. Refusing a spirit's gift was extremely dangerous. It could lead to illness, madness, even death. The spirits chose whom they would empower, and humans could not simply decline. This meant that receiving spirit power was both blessing and burden, gift and obligation. The individual who received power had to accept the responsibilities that came with it, to perform the appropriate ceremonies, to use the power for community benefit, to maintain the ritual protocols throughout their life. This understanding transforms how we think about spiritual experience. In modern Western culture, spirituality is often conceived as optional, as a personal choice, as something we can take or leave according to preference. But for Coast Salish peoples, the spiritual dimension of existence was not optional. It was simply real as mountains and salmon, and it demanded response whether one wanted that or not. Another crucial element of winter ceremonies was the Sexwakeswi mask dance, one of the most powerful and dramatic performances in Coast Salish ceremonial life. The Sexwakeswi were understood as wild men of the woods, powerful, dangerous beings who lived beyond human society, possessing tremendous strength and shamanic abilities. The Swakeswi masks were particularly striking. Large, often featuring prominent eyes and teeth, decorated with hair or shredded cedar bark to suggest wildness. When a Swakeswi dancer entered the longhouse, the atmosphere changed immediately. This was power that needed careful handling. The dance itself was violent and energetic. The Sixwakeswi dancer might charge at the audience, might grab at individuals, might display superhuman strength. Attendants would follow closely, ready to restrain the dancer if necessary, because the line between controlled performance and genuine danger was thin. These attendants carried carved sticks, basically ritual batons that symbolized their authority to manage the ceremony, and their role was crucial in ensuring safety while allowing the power to manifest. The deeper meaning of Swaksway ceremonies related to wilderness and civilization, wildness and social order. The Swaksway represented the power that existed beyond human control, the forces that could destroy human society, but also renew it. By bringing Swaksway into the longhouse through ceremony, the community was engaging with that wild power, bringing it inside their ordered world under controlled conditions, demonstrating that they could manage forces that might otherwise overwhelm them. This ancient practice reveals a profound psychological and social wisdom. Every society needs ways to engage with the chaotic, the wild, the dangerous aspects of existence. Modern culture often tries to eliminate chaos, to create total control, to banish wildness from our lives. But this is neither possible nor healthy. The forces we try to suppress often emerge in destructive ways. The Coast Salish winter ceremonies provided a ritual container for encountering chaos, wildness, and power. Within the sacred space of the longhouse, during the sacred time of winter, these forces could be engaged directly, experienced viscerally, and then reintegrated into social order. The ceremony didn't eliminate danger. It provided a controlled way to encounter danger, to touch the wild and survive, to be changed by the encounter, but not destroyed. We need such rituals today. We need safe containers for encountering what frightens us, for touching the edges of our control, for engaging with forces larger than our individual egos. The longhouse ceremonies offer a template for how to do this, through community support, through ritual structure, through experienced guidance, through acknowledgement that some things should be feared, should be respected, but should not be avoided. The winter longhouse was not just a ceremonial space. It was also the dwelling where families lived for 4 or 5 months each year, where children were raised, where elders taught and young people learned, where the complex web of Coast Salish social organization was lived out daily. Understanding Coast Salish family structure requires setting aside modern assumptions about the nuclear family, 2 parents and their children living independently. Coast Salish social organization was based on extended families, with multiple generations and multiple nuclear family units living together, cooperating economically, sharing resources, and functioning as a single social and economic entity. A single family compartment within a longhouse might house 15 to 20 people: grandparents, their adult children, their children's spouses, and multiple generations of grandchildren. But these weren't just people who happened to be related. They were an economic unit with shared ownership of resources, shared labor responsibilities, and shared ceremonial obligations. The extended family was headed by an elder, typically the oldest capable male, though women could hold this role if no appropriate male heir existed. This family head was responsible for managing family resources, for representing the family in community decisions, for ensuring that ceremonial obligations were fulfilled, and for maintaining family honor. But leadership in Coast Salish culture was not autocratic. The family head held authority through a combination of heredity, competence, and consent. An elder who made poor decisions, who failed to provide adequately, who violated social norms could effectively lose status, with younger family members deferring to others, or even splitting off to form separate households. Within the extended family, roles were clearly defined but also flexible. Men were primarily responsible for hunting, fishing, war, and ceremonial activities. Women managed gathering, processing and preserving food, manufacturing clothing and household goods, and much of the child rearing. But these divisions were not absolute. Men participated in food processing during major salmon runs, women sometimes engaged in fishing and other male activities, and both participated in ceremonies and governance. Children were raised communally within the extended family. While biological parents had special relationships with their children, aunts and uncles, grandparents, and older cousins all participated in childcare and education. This meant that knowledge and skills were transmitted not just from parent to child, but through multiple pathways, ensuring redundancy and preserving knowledge even if particular individuals died or were absent. Education was primarily through observation and participation. Children watched adults work and gradually took on age-appropriate tasks. A young child might help gather firewood or fetch water. An older child might help process fish or repair nets. A teenager might participate in hunting or fishing expeditions, learning skills that would be essential as an adult. But education wasn't just practical skills. It was also moral and spiritual training, transmitted through stories, through observation of proper behavior, through participation in ceremonies, and through direct instruction from elders who understood their role as culture bearers. What strikes me most powerfully about Coast Salish child rearing is how completely integrated children were into adult life. They weren't segregated into schools or daycare, separated from the real work of the community. They were present, in the longhouse during ceremonies, in canoes during fishing expeditions, in the forest during gathering trips. They learned by watching and doing, by being included rather than excluded. Modern society has largely lost this integration. We've created separate worlds for children, assuming that isolation from adult activities is protective or beneficial. But the cost is enormous. Children grow up disconnected from real work, from community purposes, from understanding their role in the larger social fabric. The longhouse tradition reminds us that there are other ways, that children can and should be woven into the life of the community from their earliest years. Coast Salish governance was exercised at multiple levels: family, village, and regional, each with its own structures and processes. At the family level, the elder head made day-to-day decisions about resource use and family activities. But major decisions, marriages, participation in large ceremonies, disputes with other families, would be discussed by all adult family members, with the goal of reaching consensus. At the village level, governance was more complex. Each winter village typically included multiple extended families, each with its own head. These family heads would meet to discuss community issues, planning winter ceremonies, resolving disputes, managing shared resources like fishing sites, organizing large projects like building canoes or longhouses. The village also typically had a recognized leader, often called a tayi in the coastal trade language. This was a hereditary position, passed down through families that held high status and specific ceremonial prerogatives. But heredity alone didn't guarantee leadership. A tayi had to demonstrate wisdom, generosity, and ability to maintain consensus. A tayi who couldn't fulfill these expectations might be ignored, with people following other leaders who demonstrated more effective governance. One of the tayi's primary responsibilities was hosting ceremonies and feasts, particularly the potlatch, the massive ceremonial gatherings where wealth was redistributed, social relationships renewed, and status publicly validated. The potlatch was central to Coast Salish governance because it was the mechanism through which leaders demonstrated their fitness to lead. The potlatch deserves special attention because it was so misunderstood by European colonizers that both the U.S. and Canadian governments banned it, a prohibition that lasted from the late 1800s into the mid-1900s. Colonial authorities saw the potlatch as wasteful, as preventing indigenous peoples from accumulating capital and progressing toward Western economic models. But this completely missed the point. The potlatch wasn't wasteful. It was the mechanism that prevented wealth concentration, that ensured resources circulated throughout the community, that transformed economic surplus into social capital and political legitimacy. In a potlatch, a host would give away enormous amounts of goods: blankets, food, carved items, canoes, everything accumulated over years. The giving wasn't random but carefully calculated, with each gift reinforcing social relationships, acknowledging status, and creating obligations. To receive a gift at a potlatch created an obligation to reciprocate, if not immediately then at some future time when the recipient hosted their own potlatch. This system created a kind of social banking, where wealth was stored not in personal possessions, but in networks of obligation and reciprocity. It also meant that leaders had to be generous. Hoarding would result in loss of status, while giving enhanced prestige and authority. Conflict resolution in Coast Salish society operated very differently from modern legal systems. There were no courts, no police, no written laws. Instead, disputes were resolved through a combination of family negotiation, community mediation, and ceremonial restitution. If individuals from different families came into conflict, perhaps over a fishing site, over an insult, over a debt, the families would meet to discuss the issue. Elders from both families would listen to both sides, would consider precedent and custom, would work toward a resolution that both sides could accept. The goal was not to determine absolute guilt or innocence. That Western legal concept didn't really exist in Coast Salish thought. The goal was to restore harmony, to repair the social fabric that had been torn by conflict. This meant that resolution often involved compromise, with both sides giving something, both receiving something, until balance was restored. More serious offenses, murder, serious injury, theft, required more substantial restitution. The offending family would have to provide significant compensation to the victim's family. This might include goods, resources, even marriage alliances. In extreme cases, if restitution couldn't be arranged, violent revenge might occur. But this was the last resort, not the first, because everyone understood that blood feuds could spiral into generational conflict that harmed entire communities. The winter longhouse ceremonies also played a role in conflict resolution. Potlatches provided opportunities for public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, for giving gifts that restored relationships, for making statements before the entire community that certain disputes were settled. The ceremonial context added weight and legitimacy to these resolutions in ways that simple private agreements could not. This ancient approach to justice reveals something profound about the nature of conflict and healing. Modern legal systems focus on punishment, on determining guilt and imposing consequences. But punishment doesn't heal relationships. It doesn't restore community. It doesn't actually resolve the underlying issues that created conflict. Coast Salish justice focused on restoration, on healing relationships, on maintaining community bonds. It recognized that in a small society, where everyone is interconnected through kinship and marriage, through shared resources and ceremonies, you cannot simply eliminate or permanently exclude those who cause harm. You have to find ways to reintegrate them, to restore them to right relationship with the community. This is wisdom we desperately need. Our modern societies are fractured by conflict: political, social, racial, economic. We've become expert at punishment, at exclusion, at drawing lines between us and them. But we've largely lost the skills of restoration, of finding ways back to relationship, of healing wounds rather than simply acknowledging them. The longhouse tradition offers a different path, one that recognizes our fundamental interdependence, that prioritizes healing over punishment, that understands justice not as retribution, but as the restoration of balance. As we near the end of our journey through the winter longhouse, we must address a crucial truth. This is not merely history. The winter ceremonial traditions of Coast Salish peoples are not relics preserved only in museums or anthropology texts. They are living practices, maintained by contemporary indigenous communities who have fought for over a century to preserve their culture in the face of systematic attempts at destruction. When European colonizers arrived in the Pacific Northwest, they brought more than trade goods and technology. They brought diseases that devastated indigenous populations: smallpox, measles, influenza reducing some communities by 90% or more. They brought land seizures, with the best territories claimed for settler agriculture and resource extraction. They brought missionaries who condemned native spirituality as devil worship. And they brought governmental policies explicitly designed to eradicate indigenous cultures. Children were forcibly removed from families and sent to boarding schools where native languages were forbidden, where cultural practices were punished, where the explicit goal was to kill the Indian, save the man. The winter ceremonial dances were outlawed. Potlatches were criminalized. People were jailed for participating in their own traditions. Ceremonial objects, masks, drums, regalia, were confiscated and sold to museums and collectors. This was cultural genocide, deliberately planned and systematically implemented. And it nearly succeeded, but it didn't fully succeed. Because even in the darkest times, even when ceremonies had to be held in secret, even when speaking native languages could bring punishment, people continued the traditions. Elders taught children in whispers. Ceremonies continued in hidden locations. The songs were remembered. Today, winter ceremonial traditions are experiencing a renaissance. Longhouses are being rebuilt, not as museum pieces, but as active ceremonial spaces. Young people are learning the dances, the songs, the languages their grandparents fought to preserve. Communities are reclaiming their right to practice their spirituality openly, without shame or fear. This revival is not simple nostalgia or romantic return to an idealized past. It's a recognition that Coast Salish ceremonial traditions address fundamental human needs that modern society has failed to meet. Needs for community, for spiritual connection, for relationship with the natural world, for governance systems based on consensus and responsibility rather than dominance and extraction. Contemporary Coast Salish communities face immense challenges: poverty, addiction, environmental degradation, the ongoing impacts of historical trauma. But they're also drawing on ancestral wisdom to address these challenges, recognizing that the longhouse traditions contain practical solutions to contemporary problems. The emphasis on extended family care is being revived as an alternative to foster care systems that often fail indigenous children. The ceremonial practices are being recognized as powerful tools for healing addiction and trauma. The governance principles of consensus and distributed authority are being applied to modern tribal government structures. The environmental knowledge embedded in traditional practices is being used to restore damaged ecosystems. Picture a winter evening in a contemporary Coast Salish longhouse. The building might incorporate modern materials, milled lumber, metal roofing, but its design follows ancient patterns because those patterns work, because they embody thousands of years of refined knowledge. The fire pits still burn down the center. The drums still sound. The dancers still move to rhythms unchanged for countless generations. But look closer and you'll see contemporary life interwoven with tradition. The person drumming might be a college student studying environmental science, bringing ancient ecological knowledge into dialogue with modern biology. The elder teaching a young person their spirit song might also work as a social worker, applying traditional healing practices to address modern traumas. The mask being carved for an upcoming ceremony might be made by an artist who shows in galleries, but learned their skills through the same apprenticeship process used for centuries. This is not a museum reconstruction. This is a living culture, adapting and evolving while maintaining its essential character, drawing strength from ancient roots to address contemporary challenges. What can those of us who are not Coast Salish learn from these traditions? This is a delicate question, because indigenous cultures have suffered enormously from outsiders appropriating their practices, taking ceremonies and teachings out of context, commercializing and distorting traditions for profit or spiritual tourism. But there are lessons that can be shared, principles that are universal even if their specific expressions are culturally particular. Community as the fundamental unit of human life. The longhouse tradition reminds us that we are not meant to live as isolated individuals or even as nuclear families alone. We need extended networks of support, multi-generational wisdom, structures that hold us when we falter, the inseparability of physical and spiritual dimensions. Coast Salish traditions never accepted the Western division between material and spiritual, between secular and sacred. Everything participated in both realms. This integrated understanding offers an alternative to the fragmentation that characterizes modern life. Reciprocity as the foundation of ethics. Every relationship in Coast Salish thought was understood as reciprocal exchange, with spirits, with nature, with other people. Power came with obligation. Gifts created debts. Rights implied responsibilities. This is wisdom we urgently need in an age of extraction and exploitation. Governance based on consent and service rather than domination. Leaders in longhouse traditions held authority only so long as they demonstrated wisdom and generosity. Power was distributed, decisions reached through consensus, and the goal was always harmony rather than victory. The necessity of ritual containers for encountering transformative power. We need ceremonies, need structured ways to engage with forces larger than ourselves, need communal contexts for individual transformation. The longhouse ceremonies show how this can be done safely, effectively, and in ways that strengthen rather than fragment community. As we emerge from the longhouse back into contemporary life, we carry with us the echoes of drums, the memory of firelight on carved masks, the sense of a different way of being human. The winter longhouse of the Coast Salish peoples stands as a testament to human ingenuity, spiritual depth, and social wisdom. Built without metal tools, these structures housed communities through harsh winters. Filled with ceremony and dance, they became doorways between physical and spiritual worlds. Organized around principles of reciprocity and consensus, they demonstrated that human societies can thrive without domination hierarchies or accumulation economies. This is not a lost world. It is a living tradition, maintained by people who refused to let their culture die, who understood that what their ancestors built in those longhouses was too precious, too necessary, too true to abandon. The teachings of the longhouse speak to us across centuries, reminding us that other ways are possible, that humans have built societies based on different principles than those dominating our modern world, and that these alternatives weren't primitive failures but sophisticated successes that sustained people for thousands of years. As we face the challenges of our contemporary moment, environmental crisis, social fragmentation, spiritual emptiness, governance failures, we would do well to listen to the wisdom preserved in traditions like the winter longhouse ceremonies. Not to romanticize or appropriate, not to pretend we can simply return to ancient ways, but to learn, to be humbled, to recognize that our ancestors, all our ancestors from all traditions, developed profound insights into how humans can live well on this earth. The longhouse stands, the fires still burn, the drums still sound, the ceremonies continue. And in their continuation, there is hope. Hope that cultural resilience is real, that ancestral wisdom can survive attempts at destruction, that we can learn from those who came before us, and that another way of being human remains possible. May we have the humility to learn. May we have the wisdom to honor. May we have the courage to change. The ceremony is complete. The longhouse doors open. We step back into the world, changed by what we have witnessed, carrying forward the lessons of the ancient sacred gathering.